So we have some time now to look at this set of commands, instructions, this biblical text that is known we know it as the Ten Commandments. More strictly, it is the Decalogue, which kind of translated, it's a Greek word, but translated means 10 words or 10 sayings. This is a more direct interpretation of what it is in the Hebrew. And maybe when we use that word, Decalogue, you might not know instantly, it's not the kind of word I use every day. Well, talking about the Decalogue today. But 10 words, 10 sayings, maybe that starts to change how we view these a little bit. Doesn't mean that we have to necessarily soften their impact, but maybe we can approach them in a different way that feels different from dealing with them as commandments. If that helps us to get inside them, then maybe that's helpful. And these words, as I've mentioned earlier in the service, can feel like they're from a particular time and a particular place and a particular context. It assumes a certain amount of social, economic standing for the people that it's directed at. So it assumes that people have livestock and slaves, that they have wives, so it's aimed at men in particular. It's aimed at a time when society was such that was the way that it worked. It was a society where you would have people that were slaves, you would have men would have their women as just their possessions. People would have oxen, they would be farmers. It would also assume that there was just that all parents are good. Now our experiences tell us that all parents are not good. So it also assumes these things. There are lots of things that it assumes, but that doesn't mean just because it doesn't fit with our context now, because it doesn't fit with our experience of life or what we see around us, it doesn't mean that we just throw it in the waste bin. It means that we have to therefore try and get inside it and get to understand it a bit better about what it actually means for us in our lives today. And this is how we need to approach Scripture all the time, rather than thinking, oh, well, that's a load of rubbish because that was just then and things are different now. No, we have to try and get inside it and actually see, well, if I just take away that bit of detail about that time and that place, how can I make this work, the Word of God work in my life now? How can this fit with where I am? Or am I not fitting with this? It also kind of reflects maybe even then an idealized way, an idyll of how things should be for the people of Israel, for God's chosen people. And first and foremost, at the very beginning of what it says, it sets out God. Verse 1 of chapter 20 says, "Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." It begins with God. It isn't something that Moses gives. It isn't something that humans invent. It is something that comes from God, which is given directly to Moses. That is our understanding of where these come from. And that's how important that they are. It sets out who God is and how we should live in response to who He is. We find the Ten Commandments not only here in Exodus chapter 20, but we'd also find them in Deuteronomy chapter 5, where they're restated and slight differences that we find there. But they're restated as like a recap that is there. But here, most scholars agree this is the point at which the older version, and this is where it happened. This is more of the report of how it happened, that Moses and then therefore the people of Israel received these commandments, these words, these sayings. And we might, sometimes I hear people say, well, I'm not really into the Ten Commandments because it's just a load of stuff telling us stuff that we shouldn't do, and that's not a very good way of, doing faith, is it really? It's not very now. It's not, it's just all loads of things that say about shall not do this and shall not do that. But what I would say is that whilst it is telling us some things that we should not do, it's also simply reflecting what should come naturally if we say we love God. If we say that we love God, then we should be able to do these things, or not do these things, perfectly comfortably, perfectly well. If we don't love God, if we don't have God in our lives, if we're not really that sincere about it, and we're not that authentic about it, and we're not really following through as we should do, then maybe we have more of a problem with them. So it should be actually quite easy if we've got the basic thing right, which is our relationship with God. And so do the Ten Commandments still stand for us today? I would say unreservedly, absolutely, yes. And Jesus sums them up and lives them out and teaches them in who he is and what he does. You know, we might get a bit hung up with the thing, and I kind of emphasize this sometimes, that we don't get too bogged down with all of the law stuff and all of the rules and regulations that we find throughout the rest of the Old Testament in this early part, in the first 5 books that are there. And Jesus came to reinterpret those things of the law that have become more important than actually loving God. But with regard to the Ten Commandments, it seems to me that he is simply summing them up in the way that he conducts himself, the way that he lives his life. Because I think that really he saw that too many rules kind of distract us. Too many rules put us off and become a barrier between us and achieving what we need to achieve. They're quite off-putting. The residential place where we've just been this week with the young people, it's a fantastic facility left by a farmer, a Christian farmer, and he left it in his will that he wanted it to be a Christian residential center for Christian groups to go to. It's absolutely wonderful, such a blessed place. But the person that's the warden there, very nice man indeed, but he's quite obsessed with putting signs up, notices up about don't do this, don't do that. So switch this off, don't switch that on. Long lists of rules. I never read half of them in the end. I've been there lots of years now, so I think I know most of them. But, you know, there's all these things, and after a while I just switch off. And if you go to a cafe or something and there's lots of signs telling you what you can or can't do, I don't know, it's a bit off-putting. It doesn't feel very welcoming. So there are dangers in having too many rules, too many regulations. Us, as a church, I'm sorry if you like this kind of thing, but we're not really a church that has rules. We don't have a rule book. We have a church handbook. We have a church constitution. But you know, we have this thing. And so I'm not really into churches where they have their own doctrinal list to tell you who's in and who's out in that church. And so, you know, if you see that kind of list and you're moving on to another church or going somewhere else, you know, check the list out first, because you might get to find out whether or not you're welcome there or not. But sometimes we can put so many layers on when really it needs to just be kept simple. It needs to just be kept simple, and this is what Jesus does. And so if we turn to Matthew and chapter 22 and verses 34 to 40, we will see what it is that Jesus has to say about what the greatest commandment is. Jesus says this. So chapter 22 of Matthew and verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So Jesus sums it all up. Everything, so the law, including the 10 commandments that are here, and all that the prophets say, it all hangs together, it all holds together. It can all be summed up by these 2 things. And if we get these 2 things right, then we're getting it right in terms of all of those rules and regulations that we find there. But, if you're paying attention to the reading, and if you know your 10 commandments, those things that Jesus says, they're not in the 10 commandments. Because Jesus goes elsewhere. If we were to look at Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, we would find the bit about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with everything that you have. With everything in you, loving the Lord your God. If we were to turn to Leviticus in chapter 19, verse 18, we would find the bit where it says about loving your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus takes these aspects of the law which really emphasize what is most important in order to clarify things and simplify things, because people have got so lost along the way. Even though they have the 10 Commandments, even though they have this special relationship with God, they still get a bit lost, just as we get a bit lost. And he simplifies it, that we can sum up all of this, all of the 10 Commandments and everything else, we can sum it up by the need for us to love God, the vertical thing, and the horizontal thing, for us to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And John, the disciple of Jesus, in his first letter and chapter 4, says that if we don't love our neighbor, if we don't love our brother and sister, and we say that we're loving God, then basically accuses us of being liars. The two have to go hand in hand. And Paul in Romans chapter 13 says about the importance of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, that these things can all be summed up in this. So if we get that thing, that we love God and that we love our neighbor as ourselves, then the 10 Commandments should be easy peasy for us. But what does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? What does it mean to love God? Love is quite difficult to define, difficult to understand, and means different sorts of things to different people depending on what our background is and what our experiences are. Thomas Aquinas, who was a very clever man, long time ago, a few hundred years ago, wrote about Christianity, wrote all sorts of good things, and he said that love is to will what is good for someone else. Love, well, he said, it's a bit like that, something like that he said. That's the sense of it. Love is to will what is good for someone else. Well, I'm sorry, if I meet Thomas Aquinas in heaven, which I hope I do, then he might not be too pleased with me if he's listening now, because I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, that's part of what it is to love. That's part of what it would be to observe these commandments that we have here, not to kill, not to steal, not to do this, not to do that, and to love God. But I don't think that's quite enough. You know, because you could still will something to be good for somebody, but really be really horrible to them. Yeah? So lots of husbands that are abusive towards their partner, towards their wife, for instance, or towards their children, would probably, if pressed, say that they really love that person and they want the best for them, but somehow I just can't help myself in the way that I behave, which is rubbish. But often the two go hand in hand. We might, and if we cheat on somebody, if we break one of these commandments and we commit adultery, then we might still love our wife or our husband, but we also love the other one, and we're kind of torn between. So we might will good for the person that we're hurting, or the people that we're hurting, but we're still doing wrong. So I don't think that's enough. Actions speak louder than words. Actions speak louder than simply to will something good for somebody. So therefore, for us to be able to fulfill the 10 Commandments, the first 4 of which are about us honoring and respecting and loving God. The last 6 are then about our relationship with other people, all the things about not stealing, not killing, not taking somebody else's oxen, not committing adultery. If we're to get those things right, we have to actually be acting. We have to actually be doing it. You know, we can say we love God with everything that we've got, and we want to honor him, and we won't worship anything else, but we don't turn up at church very much. Or if we do, we're kind of very last minute about it, or we don't do this, or we don't do that, or we don't spend any time in prayer with God, or we don't spend any time in Bible study reading God's word, but we say that we love him. We don't talk about God. We don't talk about Jesus when we're out there with people. People couldn't necessarily spot that we're a Christian, but we say that we love God. But it has to match up. So if we're to live out these 10 Commandments, we have to match our words, our will, with actions. We have to do it as well. And I think that's why we have these commandments here, why we have these words here, to encourage us to actually do it and to act on it, to live it out. And if we struggle with the word love in how we understand this, because I don't know if I love God or not. I'm not sure. I sort of love my neighbor, but I'm not quite sure because lots of other people just really get on my nerves. Or I don't know everybody. How can I? So what about substituting it for the word respect? That if we respect God, if we have respect for God, and so we honor God, if we have respect for our neighbor, then we honor them. If we have respect for our parents, then we honor them in this way. If we have respect for somebody, we don't take what isn't ours, what doesn't belong to us. The 10 Commandments enable us to live in harmony with each other and with God. The people of Israel were lost, had been wandering around. They weren't ready yet to go into the chosen land. They were still bickering and wanting to go back to Egypt and complaining at the slightest thing that happened. And worshipping gods that they created as opposed to the God who created them. And they needed a framework. They needed something to hold them together. And this is what this is doing here. Provides a framework for living for the people of Israel then and for us now. So how do we interpret them now? Well, I just want to finish by just offering another interpretation of what the 10 Commandments might look like today for us. It's all about God. It comes from God. Everything. Don't forget about all the things I have done for you. This is God speaking, not me. Don't forget about all the things that I have done for you over all time. It's all about God. It starts with me. Don't go putting things in the place of me. I love you in a big, everlasting way and will never desert those who love me. But it breaks my heart when you chase after money and success and short-term pleasures rather than chasing after me. And don't use my name in a disrespectful way, not as a swear word or just to back up what you're doing. Give some time to me. Take real time out with me. In fact, take time in with me. If you say, I am so important, then give me some of your time. Respect your family members. Don't cut yourself off from your heritage. Killing is not the way to go. To take someone else's life is wrong. Be faithful in your relationships. Be honest. Don't take what isn't yours. And keep your hands and your eyes off other people's stuff. Never mind what car your best friend has. Never mind what holidays they go on or how good their new conservatory looks, or never mind why it is that your younger brother or sister has got promotion and more money than you. And keep your hands off other people's husbands, wives, partners. Generally speaking, don't lust over what isn't yours. Don't be driven by the green-eyed monster. The 10 Commandments are not hard. They're not bossy. But they set out for us, as they did for the people then, a way of being that is consistent with who God is, and for us is consistent with what it is to follow Jesus.